Hi guys, imagine with me for a moment, the year is 793, and the world as many knew it was about to change forever. Off the coast of Northumbria, a small island called Lindisfarne sat quietly, its monastery, a jewel of early medieval Christianity. Monks copied sacred manuscripts, sang hymns at dawn, and tended to their daily tasks with a sense of peace and divine order. Yet, beyond the horizon, across the restless North Sea, longships cut through the waves, their carved dragon heads prowling toward destiny. This was not a chance encounter. This was a storm of steel and fire, and when it struck, it would echo through the centuries as the birth of the Viking Age. Now, before we step into the tale, I want you to picture the sharp cry of gulls above the shore, the crash of waves on ancient rocks, and the soft chiming of monastery bells calling men to prayer. And then imagine the sudden roar of horns, the splash of oars, and the sight of fierce warriors leaping onto the sands, axes raised high, eyes burning with hunger and fury. This contrasts the silence of devotion against the violence of invasions. What makes Lindisfarne's raid not just an event, but a symbol? So tonight, we will journey into that story, into the lives of the monks and the lives of the raiders, to see what really happened when those two worlds collided. Dim the light, get comfortable, and let's step into the year 793. The story begins with the monks of Lindisfarne. For years, this sacred island was a place of refuge, a center of learning, and a beacon of faith across Anglo-Saxon England. Founded by Saint Iadon in the 7th century, Lindisfarne became famous for its illuminated manuscripts, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, a treasure of art and devotion. The monks lived a simple life: prayer at set hours, labor in the fields, study of holy texts, care for the poor. Their days were guided by rhythm, their nights by candlelight. The sea was both their protector and their isolation. For Lindisfarne could only be reached at low tide when the causeway revealed itself. To most, it was a holy island set apart from the storms of the world. But to the men who sailed from Scandinavia, it was a beacon of wealth, unguarded and ripe for plunder. These raiders came from the fjords of Norway and Denmark, seafarers raised on stories of gods like Odin and Thor, men whose lives were bound to the sea and the sword. Their homes were rugged, their winters long, and their hunger for riches unending. The North Sea was not a barrier to them, it was a road, a vast highway upon which their sleek ships could glide with terrifying speed. They had heard tales from traders of fat monasteries along the English coast, filled with silver chalices, golden crosses, jeweled reliquaries, and unlike towns or fortresses, these holy places had no walls, no warriors to defend them. To the Vikings, they were easy prey. On that fateful summer's day in 793, the monks of Lindisfarne rose before dawn as always. The bell tolled, calling them to matins, the early morning prayer. They filed into the church, their chants rising with the mist. Brother Cuthbert, the scribe, carried his worn quill, already thinking of the page he would illuminate that day. Brother Elfric, the gardener, thought of his herbs and the fish he would catch later along the shore. To them, the sea was the same as it had always been, mysterious but familiar, dangerous yet constant. None of them suspected that the horizon carried their doom. Far out on the water, the first long ship appeared, its sail a dark triangle against the pale morning sky. Then another, and another. A small fleet, cutting fast and low, each prow carved with grim faces to frighten spirits and men alike. At the oars sat warriors, hardened by salt and steel, their hair bound, their eyes sharp. They did not come for trade, nor for friendship, they came for fire and blood. As the ships drew closer, a watchful monk on the shore caught sight of them. Perhaps at first he thought them merchants, for traders had sometimes visited the coast. But as the figures grew clearer, as the weapons gleamed and the shouts carried, he knew the truth. His cry of alarm rang across the island, but by then it was too late. The longships struck the shore with a thud, warriors splashing into the shallows. Shields rose, spears flashed, and voices roared in a language the monks could not understand. The raiders charged up the beach, moving with terrifying swiftness. The monks scattered, some running for the monastery, others frozen in place. Brother Cuthbert dropped his quill, his hand trembling as he clutched at his cross. Brother Elfric fell to his knees, praying for mercy. But mercy was not what these men had come to give. The first clash came as the raiders stormed into the monastery grounds. Doors splintered beneath axe blows, and the once sacred halls were filled with screams. Chalices were ripped from altars, holy books hurled aside. The monks, unarmed and untrained, could do nothing but flee or die. Some were cut down where they stood, their blood staining the stone floors. Others were dragged away, bound in ropes, destined for slavery in far-off lands. The raiders showed no reverence for holy things. The cross was trampled, relics stolen, shrines desecrated. For the Vikings, this was victory. Gold and silver glittered in their hands, and captives wept at their feet. The monastery burned, smoke curling into the sky, a dark signal to the mainland of what had come. And though it was but one raid, its shock reverberated across all of Christendom. To the Anglo-Saxons, it seemed as though demons had risen from the sea, striking at the very heart of their faith. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it with dread. In this year, fierce foreboding omens came over the land of the Northumbrians, and the harrowing inroads of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. The raid was not just an attack on a monastery. It was the beginning of something far larger. The people of England saw the true might of the Norsemen, and they knew more would come. The sea was no longer a shield, but a door through which terror could walk at any time. Kings and lords scrambled to fortify their coasts, to arm their men, to pray for protection. But in truth, nothing could stop the tide. Meanwhile, for the Vikings, Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Word of their success spread quickly through their homelands. Wealth, glory, and slaves could be taken across the seas, and the Christians were weak, their treasures undefended. More ships would set out in the years that followed, striking deeper into England, into Ireland, into France. Lindisfarne was their first strike, but it was far from their last. For the monks who survived, life was never the same. Those who were not killed or taken into slavery rebuilt what they could, clinging to faith even in the face of ruin. They saw the raid as a punishment from God, a test of their devotion, a reminder of the frailty of man. But deep in their hearts, the terror of that day never left them. The sound of the horn, the crash of the oars, the sight of strangers with fire in their eyes. And so the legend of Lindisfarne was born, not just a tale of loss, but of a world turned upside down. It marked the clash of two civilizations, one of prayer, one of plunder. It showed the strength of the sea peoples, the vulnerability of Christendom, and the birth of an age that would shape Europe for centuries. The raid of 793 was small in numbers, but vast in meaning. It was the spark that lit the fire, the shadow that spread across kingdoms. Lindisfarne would never again be the quiet refuge it once was. Its memory would echo down the centuries, whispered in fear, remembered in chronicles, painted in the minds of men as the moment when the Vikings came. The smoke from Lindisfarne's burning monastery curled high into the sky, a black banner drifting over the Northumbrian coast. From villages inland, peasants and fishermen saw it rising like an omen and whispered in fear. Some clutched their children, muttering prayers, while others stared in silence, unable to comprehend what force could bring fire to God's holy island. Messengers rode swiftly to the halls of Northumbrian lords, spreading word of the attack. The news spread like wildfire, and with it came dread, because if the Holy Isle could fall, then nowhere was safe. King Tellard of Northumbria received the message with horror. He had known of raiders before occasional skirmishes along the coast, petty thieves in boats seeking quick plunder, but this was different. This was organized, brutal, and deliberate. The monastery was not only a center of wealth but of prestige, a place tied deeply to the Christian identity of his kingdom. To see it destroyed was to feel as though the very foundation of faith had been shaken. The king's advisers debated whether this was the work of men or demons. Some argued it was divine punishment for the sins of the people. Others believed it was a test of their resolve. But all agreed on one thing. The North Sea was no longer a boundary, but a gateway to terror. The monks who survived the slaughter wandered in shock. Those who had escaped into the fields returned cautiously after the raiders departed, only to find their brothers slain, their church desecrated, and their treasures gone. Brother Cuthbert knelt amid the ashes, clutching a fragment of parchment scorched by fire. It had once been a page of the Lindisfarne Gospels, painstakingly illuminated with gold and color. Now it was blackened, fragile, almost lost. Tears blurred his eyes as he whispered a prayer. To him, the raid was not only the loss of lives and gold, but of God's beauty itself, torn and trampled underfoot. But the Vikings were not done. Laden with loot and captives, they pushed their long ships back into the sea, sails swelling with the wind. Their laughter echoed across the waves, for this raid had brought them more wealth than many could earn in a lifetime at home. The silver chalices and golden crosses would be melted down or traded. The bound monks would be sold in distant markets, their chants silenced by the crack of whips. To the raiders, it was a glorious success, and news of it would stir restless hearts across the fjords. Back in Scandinavia, the returning warriors were greeted with awe. They displayed their treasures proudly, their stories growing grander with each telling. They spoke of soft monks who knelt rather than fought, of sacred halls filled with riches and undefended by walls. For young men eager for adventure, these tales were irresistible. Soon more longships were built, more warriors gathered, and the hunger for plunder grew insatiable. Lindisfarne was no longer just a raid, it was an invitation. In England, fear spread across the coasts. Other monasteries and villages began to fortify what little they could. Priests preached of God's wrath, warning the people to repent, lest more calamities befall them. Some said that strange omens had preceded the raid: lightning in the sky, whirlwinds, fiery dragons seen flying through the air. Whether real or imagined, such tales filled the people with terror. To them, the Northmen were more than men, they were monsters, instruments of chaos sent to punish the land. Yet the Anglo-Saxon lords were not united. Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia each looked to their own defenses, suspicious of one another. Old rivalries and power struggles weakened their ability to stand together. To the Vikings, this disunity was a gift. They did not need to conquer kingdoms outright. Not yet. They only needed to strike swiftly, plundering where they pleased, retreating before large forces could gather. And so the pattern began. Sails on the horizon, panic on the shore, smoke rising behind them. The year after Lindisfarne raids struck again. Monasteries along the coasts of Jarrow and Wearmouth were attacked. Monks who had once thought themselves safe now trembled at every strange sail. Inland villages lived in constant anxiety, for though the raiders often struck the coasts, their longships could also sail up rivers, bringing destruction deep into the countryside. Fishermen no longer trusted the sea, and farmers prayed each day that the horizon would remain empty. For the Vikings, the rhythm of raiding became a way of life. A summer campaign would bring riches. Winter would be spent feasting, repairing ships, telling tales of conquest. Children grew up hearing of Lindisfarne as a glorious beginning, a tale of how the sea brought power to those bold enough to seize it. Chiefs and jarls competed to lead new expeditions, each hoping to surpass the fame of those who had first struck the Holy Isle. But while many saw only plunder, others began to see opportunity. Beyond the quick raids, there were fertile lands in England, rich soil compared to the rocky coasts of Scandinavia. If monasteries could be so easily taken, perhaps entire regions could be settled. Seeds of ambition were sown alongside the lust for gold. Lindisfarne had not only opened the door to raiding, it had opened the imagination to conquest. Meanwhile, in the halls of learning and faith across Europe, the raid on Lindisfarne shocked scholars and church leaders. Letters were written, chroniclers recorded the calamity, and bishops urged kings to defend Christendom. To them, the Vikings were not merely bandits, they were heathens, striking at the heart of Christian civilization. Sermons thundered with calls to repentance, blaming the sins of the people for inviting such horror. Yet, while they preached, the longships kept coming. On Lindisfarne itself, the surviving monks tried to rebuild. Their faith, though shaken, was not destroyed. They patched the walls, copied what texts they could save, and continued their prayers. But the memory lingered. Each sound of the sea reminded them of that dreadful day, each gull's cry echoing the horns of the raiders. Some left the island altogether, seeking safer monasteries inland. Others stayed, stubborn in their devotion, determined that the light of God would not be extinguished even by the fiercest of storms. The landscape of power in England began to shift. Kings realized that the Viking threat was not a passing storm, but a new era. Fortifications were built along rivers and coasts. Armies were trained to respond more quickly. Yet the Vikings adapted as well, striking where defenses were weakest, vanishing before large forces could assemble. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the mice had teeth, and the cats were often too slow. In the Scandinavian homelands, the wealth from raiding transformed society. Chiefs who led successful expeditions grew richer, gaining followers and influence. Political power began to centralize around those who could command fleets. Families displayed silver and gold at feasts, proof of their prowess. And with wealth came ambition, not only for more raids, but for power at home. The Viking Age was shaping not only England but Scandinavia itself, forging stronger leaders and larger visions. As decades passed, the shadow of Lindisfarne never faded. It remained the symbol, the beginning, the strike that echoed across Europe. Chroniclers would point back to it as the moment when the heathens first unleashed their fury. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was a wound that never healed, a reminder that even the holiest places could burn. For the Vikings, it was a tale of triumph, retold by firesides, inspiring new generations to take up the oar and the axe. But the story of Lindisfarne was not only about destruction, it was about transformation. It forced kingdoms to rethink their defenses, forced monks to cling more tightly to their faith, forced Scandinavia to expand beyond its fjords. It was the spark that lit centuries of conflict, exploration, and change. The men who had first stepped ashore that day in 793 could never have known the legacy they were creating. To them, it was simply a raid, a chance for plunder. Yet history would remember it as the birth of an age. The longships would not stop. They would return again and again until the coasts of Europe knew their shapes as well as their own shadows. Lindisfarne was only the beginning, and the world would never be the same. The years after Lindisfarne unfolded like a storm, rolling across the shores of England and beyond. No longer was the raid on the Holy Island seen as an isolated calamity. It was the beginning of a pattern that repeated itself with greater ferocity. From the northern coasts of Scotland to the southern shores of Wessex, sails began to appear more often, and each sighting carried dread. Fishermen would return to villages, speaking of dragon-prowed ships gliding swiftly through mist, their sails like wings of shadow. Monks, once devoted only to prayer, now kept fearful watch on the horizon as much as they bent over their manuscripts. What had begun as a single violent spark was fanning into a fire that spread across all of Christendom. By the middle of the 9th century, raids were no longer confined to swift strikes. Instead, Viking fleets grew larger, sometimes numbering dozens of ships. With them came hundreds of warriors, men hardened by battle and driven by the promise of wealth. These were no longer just adventurers, testing their fortune. They were organized war bands, capable of crushing resistance wherever it stood. Monasteries remained prime targets for their treasures and lack of defenses, but towns and villages now also found themselves under attack. The rhythm of the raids became predictable. In one sense, they came in spring or summer, when seas were calmer but unpredictable in another, for no man knew where they would land. In Ireland, the Vikings carved deeper wounds. They struck at monasteries like Clonmacnoise and Glendalough, burning sacred sites that had flourished for centuries. But unlike in England, where they often raided and departed, in Ireland the Norse began to settle. They established fortified bases, long forts, near rivers and coasts, places where their ships could be moored safely and from which they could launch further raids inland. Dublin itself, founded in 841, began as one such Norse settlement. From there, they expanded their power, integrating with local politics, sometimes allying with Irish kings, sometimes fighting them. What began as raiding grew into colonization, and the Norse presence became part of the Irish landscape. In England, the response to the Vikings varied from kingdom to kingdom. Northumbria, still reeling from Lindisfarne, suffered repeated blows. Monasteries along its coasts were plundered, and its kings often proved too weak or too divided to mount effective defenses. Mercia, to the south, fared somewhat better, with its greater resources and stronger rulers, but even it could not hold back every raid. East Anglia was vulnerable, its low coasts easy for longships to reach. Wessex in the south began to emerge as the strongest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. though it too felt the sting of Norse axes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records with sorrow the increasing toll. Year after year, entries spoke of heathen men laying waste to villages, slaying priests, burning churches. Each raid seemed to confirm the belief that God was punishing the land for its sins. Yet, amid the despair, there were also moments of defiance. Local lords sometimes gathered bands of warriors to fight back, and, though often outmatched, they occasionally succeeded in driving the raiders off. These small victories became sources of pride, though they did little to stop the larger tide. The Vikings themselves grew bolder with each success. They learned the weaknesses of their enemies and exploited them ruthlessly. They knew that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were often at odds with one another, too concerned with their rivalries to unite fully against the foreign threat. They used speed and surprise to their advantage, striking before armies could gather, vanishing into the sea before retaliation could reach them. Their long ships were unmatched in design, shallow enough to sail up rivers, swift enough to outpace most pursuers, sturdy enough to cross the open sea. With such tools, they seemed unstoppable. But even as they plundered, the Vikings brought change in subtler ways. Their presence forced the Anglo-Saxons to rethink their defenses. Kings began to invest in stronger fortifications, building burrs-fortified towns that could resist raids. Armies were reorganized, with more emphasis placed on mobility and readiness. A system of watchmen along coasts and rivers became more common to provide early warnings of approaching fleets. The fear of the Vikings, though devastating, also pushed the kingdoms toward greater unity and strength. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Frankish lands were suffering as well. The rivers of France provided easy pathways for Viking ships, and the Seine, Loire, and Garonne became highways of terror. In 845, a fleet led by the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok sailed up the Seine and attacked Paris itself. The city was forced to pay a ransom of thousands of pounds of silver to be spared. Such displays of power stunned Europe, for they showed that even great cities could not withstand the Northmen. The Carolingian rulers, like Charles the Bald, often chose to buy off the raiders rather than face their fury, paying them to leave in hopes of avoiding greater destruction. Yet such payments only encouraged more raids, as silver and gold flowed back to Scandinavia. The wealth pouring into Norse hands transformed their societies. Chiefs who returned with treasure gained status and followers, their halls filled with feasts and gifts. Warriors sought out leaders who could promise plunder, swelling the ranks of ambitious men. And with wealth came the desire for more than seasonal raids. Men began to settle permanently in the lands they raided, drawn by fertile soil and opportunities for trade. The seeds of the great Viking settlements in England, Ireland, and Normandy were sown in this age of expansion. For the monks of Lindisfarne, their story became part of this larger tapestry. Though the monastery was rebuilt and continued its holy work, it never regained the peace it once knew. The memory of the raid remained sharp, passed down in writings and tales. Every new raid across England was measured against that first calamity, as though Lindisfarne had set the scale by which all Viking fury would be judged. The island remained a symbol, a reminder of vulnerability, but also of endurance. The psychological impact of the Vikings was immense. To the Anglo-Saxons and Franks, they seemed like a people apart, almost otherworldly in their ferocity. Their pagan rituals, their strange gods, their willingness to desecrate holy sites, all marked them as different, frighteningly alien. Yet, over time, familiarity grew. As Norsemen settled, they married local women, traded with local merchants, and became part of the societies they had once terrorized. Fear slowly gave way to grudging adaptation. Still, in the 9th century, the terror was real and raw. In 865, the great heathen army landed in England, a massive force, unlike the earlier raiding parties. It was not merely a band of plunderers, but an army intent on conquest. Led by sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, it swept across the kingdoms, toppling rulers and seizing lands. Northumbria fell, its king slain. East Anglia was conquered. Mercia struggled to survive. Only Wessex, under the leadership of King Alfred, would eventually mount a resistance strong enough to halt the tide. But all of that stemmed from the first sparks lit at Lindisfarne. That raid had shown what was possible. It had revealed the weaknesses of Christian kingdoms, the riches to be gained, the ease with which the sea could carry destruction to new shores. The men who first stormed the monastery could never have imagined the vast armies and settlements their example would inspire. But history traced a direct line from their oars to the great struggles of later generations. The expansion of the Vikings changed not only politics but culture. Norse art and craftsmanship spread through the lands they touched, blending with local traditions. Place names across England still bear traces of their language. Legal systems absorbed aspects of Norse custom. Even the English tongue itself would be reshaped by contact with Old Norse, its words and rhythms altered in subtle but lasting ways. In Scandinavia, the wealth and influence from raiding laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of kingdoms. Ambitious rulers used their plunder to consolidate power, establishing stronger monarchies. The Viking Age was not only about outward expansion, but about internal transformation, as Scandinavia shifted from scattered clans to organized realms. Through it all, the shadow of Lindisfarne remained. It was recalled in chronicles with horror, retold by Vikings with pride, remembered by monks with sorrow. The island became a symbol of the clash between two worlds, one of prayer and faith, the other of steel and sea. And though centuries would pass, the memory of that first raid continued to echo, shaping how generations understood the Viking Age. The expansion did not cease quickly. Raids grew into settlements, settlements into colonies, colonies into new identities. In Normandy, Norse settlers became the Normans, blending with the Franks, and eventually shaping the history of France and England alike. In Ireland, Dublin grew into a powerful Norse-Irish kingdom. In England, the Danelaw would emerge, a swath of territory under Viking rule, reshaping the map of the land. Each of these transformations had its roots in the first bold leap from ship to shore at Lindisfarne. The world after Lindisfarne was not the same as the world before. The North Sea, once a dividing line, became a bridge across which cultures clashed and mingled. The fear of dragon-prowed ships never fully left the coasts of Europe, but alongside fear grew resilience, adaptation, and change. The story of Lindisfarne, of that first terrible raid, thus became not only a tale of destruction, but of the beginnings of a new age of Viking Age that would shape the destiny of nations for centuries to come. The great heathen army that landed in England in 865 marked a turning point. For decades, the Norse had raided the coasts, striking monasteries, villages, and towns before retreating back across the sea. But this force was something different, larger, more organized, and far more ambitious. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrokavere, the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubet, carried with it not just the desire for plunder, but for conquest. Its arrival changed the balance of power in England, and in its shadow, the legacy of Lindisfarne found its full meaning. The army first struck Northumbria, already weakened by years of internal conflict. The kingdom had once been a beacon of Christian learning, its monasteries like Lindisfarne and Jarrow shining centers of knowledge. But by the mid-9th century, it was divided by rival claimants to the throne. The Vikings exploited this weakness, storming York in 866 and defeating the Northumbrian forces sent against them. King Gla was captured, and according to saga tradition, executed by the gruesome Blood Eagle, though chroniclers in England recorded only his death in battle. Whatever the truth, Northumbria fell, and with it, one of the pillars of Anglo-Saxon England crumbled. From there, the great army moved south. In East Anglia, the Vikings extracted tribute before turning west into Mercia, forcing submission from its rulers. In 869, they returned to East Anglia and captured King Edmund, who, refusing to renounce his faith, was executed by being bound to a tree and shot with arrows until he died. He was later venerated as a martyr and saint, but his death marked the destruction of his kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded these years with sorrow, each entry like a tolling bell announcing another disaster. As kingdom after kingdom fell, only Wessex remained as a bastion of resistance. In 871, Alfred, the younger brother of King Tellard, took the throne after his brother's death in battle. Alfred was not immediately successful. He faced defeats and was forced to pay tribute to the Vikings to buy time. But unlike other kings, Alfred adapted. He studied the ways of the Norse, their speed and unpredictability, and began to reshape his kingdom's defenses. He built a network of burhs, fortified towns placed strategically so that no settlement was more than a day's march from another. These burhs could resist Viking assaults and provide refuge for local populations. Alfred also reorganized the fyrd, the levy of free men called to arms, into a rotating system so that some could fight while others remained at home to tend the land. This prevented the exhaustion that had plagued earlier defenses. He even invested in a navy, building ships larger than the Viking longships, though they were not always successful in battle. Despite his efforts, Alfred's kingdom came close to ruin. In 878, the Vikings launched a surprise attack in winter, catching Alfred off guard and forcing him to flee into the marshes of Athelney. There, with only a small band of followers, he waged a guerrilla campaign, striking at Viking forces and rallying his people. Legend tells of how, while hiding in a peasant's home, Alfred once let cakes burn because he was so lost in thought about strategy, earning a scolding from the woman who did not recognize her king. From such humble circumstances, he rebuilt his strength, gathering men from across Wessex. At the Battle of Edington in 878, Alfred confronted the Viking leader Guthrum and won a decisive victory. The Vikings were forced to retreat, and Guthrum himself was baptized as part of the peace terms, taking the name Athelstan. This marked a turning point. Though the Vikings still held large parts of England, especially in the north and east, the Wessex had survived, and from its survival would grow the unification of England. The lands under Viking control became known as the Danelaw, stretching across much of eastern and northern England. Within the Danelaw, Norse laws, customs and language mixed with Anglo-Saxon traditions. Towns like York, called Jorvik by the Norse, became centers of trade and culture, bustling with markets filled with goods from across the Viking world, furs from the north, silver from the east, slaves from raids. The Norse presence left deep marks, from place names ending in by and thorpe to words that entered the English language. Farmers in the Danal plowed the soil beside Norse settlers, and over generations the sharp lines between conqueror and conquered blurred. Alfred's successors continued his work, pushing back against the Norse and gradually reclaiming lands. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Telfuld, Lady of the Mercians, expanded Wessex's influence and reconquered parts of the Danala. Their campaigns built upon Alfred's foundations, uniting Anglo-Saxon England under stronger leadership. By the time of Alfred's grandson, Aethelstan, in the early 10th century, England was on the path to becoming a single kingdom, though Viking raids still loomed as a threat. The Viking Age did not fade quickly. Throughout the 10th and early 11th centuries, new waves of raiders continued to arrive, drawn by England's wealth. In some cases, kings like Thellard the Unready paid huge sums of silver, known as Danegeld, to persuade them to leave. But such payments often encouraged further attacks, for word spread quickly that England was rich and willing to buy peace. The cycle of tribute and plunder repeated, draining resources and sowing resentment. In the early 11th century, the Viking threat reached its peak once more when Svein Forkbeard of Denmark launched an invasion. By 1013, he had seized the English crown, though he died shortly afterward. His son Canute the Great followed, ruling England as part of a North Sea empire that also included Denmark and Norway. Under Canute, the Norse and Anglo-Saxon worlds were more deeply intertwined than ever before. He ruled not as a foreign conqueror alone, but as a king who sought to integrate his realms, supporting the church and upholding laws while still drawing upon his Viking heritage. Sienut's reign represented the height of Viking power in England, but also the beginning of the end. After his death in 1035, his sons were unable to hold the empire together, and the old royal line of Wessex was restored. The last great Viking invasion came in 1066, when Harald Hardrada of Norway sought the English throne. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, he was defeated by Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon king, in a bloody fight that ended the age of Viking invasions. Yet even this victory proved fleeting, for only weeks later, Harold faced William of Normandy, himself a descendant of Vikings, at Hastings, where the Norman conquest forever altered England. Looking back, the arc that began at Lindisfarne stretched across nearly 3 centuries. The raid on that quiet monastery in 793 had seemed at first a singular horror, a burst of violence from unknown men across the sea, but it had opened the floodgates to an age of raiding, conquest, settlement, and transformation. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been shattered and reforged. Scandinavia had been enriched and reshaped, and the map of Europe had been altered forever. The legacy of Lindisfarne lived on in chronicles, in place names, in the scars left upon churches and villages. To monks and priests, it remained a symbol of divine punishment and human frailty, a reminder that even holy places could fall. To the Norse, it was a tale of daring and triumph, the first step in a saga that carried them across seas to new worlds. To historians, it stands as the moment when the Viking Age began, when Europe awoke to the reality of a new force rising from the north. Yet the legacy was not only one of destruction. The blending of cultures in the Danelaw, the exchanges of trade and language, the reshaping of kingdoms, these were also part of the Viking story. Out of the fire and blood of raids emerged new societies, richer for their diversity, stronger for their trials. The England that eventually emerged under kings like Alfred and Athelstan was not the same land that had seen Lindisfarne burn. It was tougher, more unified, more aware of the world beyond its shores. And in Scandinavia, the wealth and connections gained through raiding and settlement laid the foundation for the later kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The Viking Age eventually gave way to the Age of Kings and of Christianity, as Norse rulers converted and their people embraced the new faith. But the memory of their ancestors' voyages and battles lived on in sagas carved into runestones, sung in halls by skalds who recalled with pride the daring of those who had first crossed the sea. The story of Lindisfarne thus ends not with the silence of ruins, but with the echoes of transformation. What began as terror became history, and what was history became legend. The monks who prayed on that island could never have foreseen the vast changes their attackers would set in motion. The Vikings who leaped from their ships could never have imagined how their deeds would be remembered. But between them, in blood and fire, they forged a new chapter of Europe's story. And so the raid on Lindisfarne, born in violence, became something greater than either side intended. It was the spark of an age, the call of the sea, the clash of faith and steel. Its memory still lingers, carried on the wind across the waves, whispered in chronicles, sung in sagas, etched into the very fabric of history. The streets came alive in the early morning as the first rays of sun spilled over the thatched rooftops and stone towers of a medieval town. From every corner, carts creaked and horses snorted, their hooves clattering on cobblestones as traders, farmers, and artisans made their way toward the square where the great market would be held. The smell of damp earth from freshly picked vegetables mingled with the sharper scent of cured meats and the faint sweetness of honeycombs carried in wicker baskets. Merchants in rough homespun tunics walked beside those in finer wool dyed in bright hues, their clothing a mark of the wealth that trade could bring. Bells from the church tower rang out, calling the faithful to prayer. But they also served another purpose, a reminder that today was market day, a day when the town became the beating heart of commerce, gossip, and spectacle. At the center of the square, stalls were already being erected. Wooden trestles were covered with cloths of coarse linen or brightly woven fabric to display wares. Farmers laid out bundles of leeks, cabbages, onions, and herbs, while butchers prepared tables where cuts of pork, beef, and mutton would be arranged. Bakers arrived with baskets of fresh loaves, their golden crusts warm from the ovens, while fishmongers spread nets, heavy with the morning's catch, their stalls pungent with the smell of salt and river water. Craftsmen, too, were eager to show their goods. Blacksmiths displayed nails, hinges, and tools, while coopers stacked barrels, and potters arranged rows of earthenware jugs and bowls glazed with earthy browns and greens. The noise grew steadily as the crowd swelled. Buyers haggled loudly, their voices competing with the shouts of sellers eager to catch attention. Children darted through the throng, some helping their parents carry goods, others sneaking looks at brightly colored ribbons or sweetmeats sold by traveling peddlers. The air was alive with languages and accents, for markets attracted not only locals but traders from distant towns and even foreign lands. A cloth merchant from Flanders might unfold bolts of fine wool, smoother and softer than anything woven locally, while an Italian spice dealer opened small wooden boxes filled with treasures, pepper, cinnamon, saffron that seemed more precious than gold. For many, the market was not just about buying and selling, but about connection. News traveled with merchants faster than through messengers. Stories of wars, plagues, or distant kings spread from one mouth to another, sometimes growing grander with each telling. A farmer who had never left his village might hear tales of crusaders marching east or of great ships crossing seas to lands filled with wonders. Markets were windows to the world, expanding horizons with every exchange. Fairs were even greater spectacles. Unlike weekly markets, fairs were rare, often tied to feast days of saints or charters granted by kings. They lasted for days or even weeks, drawing people from across regions. Entire temporary towns would spring up in meadows or along major roads, tents and stalls stretching as far as the eye could see. Travelers pitched their canvas shelters, cooking over small fires at night, while by day they mingled among throngs so thick that one could hardly move without brushing shoulders. In the grandest fairs, such as those in Champagne or St. Ives, the diversity of goods was astounding. Merchants came from across Europe, wool from England, wine from France, furs from the Baltic, glassware from Venice, silk from the East. Caravans brought exotic wares from faraway lands, ivory, precious stones, and strange spices whose aromas perfumed the air. For locals, even seeing such goods was an experience bordering on the miraculous, and the chance to purchase them if one had the coin was unforgettable. Guilds played a crucial role in shaping these markets and fairs. Craftsmen organized themselves into guilds that regulated quality, set prices, and protected their members. A shoemaker who tried to sell substandard shoes could be fined or expelled, while apprentices had to serve years of training before earning the right to set up their own stall. Guilds also ensured fairness for customers, so that the reputation of the town's trade remained strong. Their banners often hung above the stalls, displaying symbols of their craft: scissors for tailors, hammers for smiths, or loaves for bakers. Entertainment was never far from commerce. Jugglers, minstrels, and storytellers roamed the edges of the crowds, performing for coins. A man might play the lute and sing ballads of knights and ladies, while another balanced on stilts or swallowed fire. Trained animals drew laughter, a bear dancing to the beat of a drum, or a monkey dressed in tiny garments mimicking the gestures of the crowd. Mystery plays were sometimes performed, retelling biblical stories with painted props and crude costumes, both to instruct and to amuse. Children gazed wide-eyed, while adults laughed, clapped, or shook their heads at the antics. Food was everywhere, a delight and temptation for those with a few pennies to spare. Pies filled with meat and onions, roasted chestnuts, wheels of cheese, honey cakes, and jugs of ale, these turned the market into a feast for the senses. The smell of roasting meats drifted through the air, mingling with the aroma of fresh bread and herbs. Even those who could not afford to buy much enjoyed tasting samples or sharing a simple treat, for part of the magic of fairs was indulgence. a brief break from the hard rhythms of daily life. Markets and fairs were also places of danger and tension. Pickpockets prowled the crowds, their fingers quick as snakes, slipping purses from belts or stealing goods from distracted sellers. Disputes over prices could escalate into fights, and drunken quarrels were common once ale began to flow freely. To maintain order, town officials or guards patrolled the grounds, enforcing laws and settling arguments. Serious criminals might face harsh punishments on the spot, whipped or placed in the stocks as a warning to others. Beyond buying and selling, fairs were venues for agreements that shaped communities. Farmers arranged marriages for their children, sealing alliances that tied families together. Lords and merchants negotiated contracts, discussing rents, taxes, or transport of goods. Pilgrims stopped at shrines set up near the fairgrounds, offering prayers before continuing their journeys. Even justice was sometimes dispensed at fairs, as courts convened to hear cases while people gathered, making use of the wide attendance. The excitement built as evening fell. Torches flared to light the stalls, their flames flickering in the wind. Shadows danced across the tents, while the music of fiddles and drums rose above the din. People ate and drank, their voices loud with merriment. Deals struck during the day were celebrated at night, and friendships were cemented over shared mugs of ale. For those who had come from distant villages, the fair was not only about trade, but about memory, a chance to tell their children they had seen wonders, heard strange tongues, tasted foreign spices. When dawn broke again, the cycle continued. Traders rose early to reset their stalls, and townsfolk hurried to secure the best goods. Some merchants, their purses heavy, prepared to move on, while others lingered, hoping to sell just a little more. Gradually, as the days passed, the fair would thin. Wagons creaked as they rolled out of town, laden with purchases bound for distant places. Fields once filled with tents grew empty again, leaving only trampled grass and scraps of refuse to remind locals of the great gathering. The rhythm of medieval life returned to its usual pace, but the memories of the fair lingered long after. Children dreamed of jugglers and fire eaters. Wives treasured bolts of cloth or tiny trinkets bought by their husbands, and men spoke of bargains struck or news heard. In a world where travel was rare and horizons narrow, markets and fairs expanded life, bringing color, sound, and taste into otherwise ordinary days. The power of markets and fairs lay not only in commerce, but in their ability to bind communities together. They were moments of unity, when rich and poor, local and foreign, sacred and secular, all mingled. They embodied the spirit of medieval society, a mixture of hardship and celebration, of faith and festivity, of survival and splendor. In their noise and bustle, one could hear the heartbeat of the Middle Ages itself. The wagons rolled away and the fairgrounds slowly emptied. But the life of medieval markets never truly ended, for they returned again and again with each passing season. The merchants carried with them not only their profits, but the impressions they had left behind. The Flemish cloth seller remembered the eager English wives who fingered his silks. The spice dealer thought of the wide-eyed farmers who had smelled cinnamon for the first time, and the minstrel who sang under torchlight replayed in his mind the chorus of voices that had joined his refrain. These journeys shaped their reputations. For a trader known to be honest and fair could expect customers to seek him out at the next gathering. In this way, trust itself became a kind of currency, built slowly across years and across borders. Life between markets was quieter, but anticipation always simmered beneath the surface. Villagers saved coins, bartered goods, and made plans for the next event, sometimes walking for days to reach the nearest town. The young saw fairs as opportunities for adventure and perhaps romance. For meetings under the banners of guilds often led to whispered promises and arranged unions. For lords and officials, fairs were a matter of power. For every toll paid at the gate, every tax on goods, swelled the coffers of a manor or crown. A well-run fair could enrich a whole region, while one struck by misfortune, bad weather, bandit attacks, or plague mean ruin. As centuries passed, these markets grew ever more sophisticated. Permanent stalls replaced rough trestles. Stone halls were built where merchants could gather indoors. And fairs became international exchanges that knit together the economies of Europe. Yet even as they expanded in scale, the essence remained: the laughter of children chasing tumblers, the rich smell of bread baking, the bargaining voices that rose and fell like waves, and the mingling of strangers who, for a brief time, were neighbors. The medieval market was never just about trade. It was about weaving the threads of society tighter, creating bonds of culture and commerce that endured long after the tents were folded and the torches dimmed.